Across the Australis Conservatory's twin domes, billions of neural echoes buzzed under starlight. Tonight, one cadet would rewrite the meaning of victory, not through firepower or fear, but by turning the pride of the galaxy's greatest strategists against themselves. In a battlefield where every mind was a weapon, Kalen Voss would prove that the deadliest force is belief. The auditorium pulsed with silent anticipation. Seated in an enormous ring surrounding the central celestial strategy nexus, alien cadets from more than 30 different species glanced at one another with subtle tension in their eyes. The Australis War Conservatory's war strategy test was not just a final exam. It was a rite of passage. Those who passed with distinction earned high-ranking placements across the interstellar coalition. Those who failed were quietly recycled into lesser roles, logistics research, sometimes even civil engineering. The chamber's lights dimmed to a deep blue, and a holographic interface lit up the center of the arena. Transparent panels unfolded from the walls, glowing with the data feeds of each cadet. The voice of the lead instructor, a towering insectoid named Admiral Zephyron, boomed through the hall without the aid of speakers, initiating combat strategy nexus protocol. All cadets, prepare your virtual armies. The platform shifted. A vast holographic terrain materialized, replicating a 1,000-square-kilometer battlefield filled with mountain ranges, dry riverbeds, ruined alien cities, and forested plateaus. It was a landscape designed to force adaptive thinking where every move required foresight and sacrifice. From his small station near the edge of the arena, Kalen Voss adjusted his mind-link halo and leaned forward. He was the only human enrolled in the academy this cycle, a fact that brought him no favors. Most of the alien cadets considered him a curiosity at best, a primitive anomaly at worst. For weeks he had endured stares, tears, and quiet laughter during training exercises while others came from militarized planets and war-bred dynasties. He was a civilian student from Earth. Prime admitted on scholarship due to a high theoretical strategy score and pre-entrance exams. The moment the countdown reached 0 dozens of alien students, immediately sprang into action. A telepathic Xanthari female summoned entire legions of crystal tanks using a thought-to-construct module. A Vakhtun warlord covered in black and red exoskeletal armor unleashed a swarm of insectoid drones equipped with corrosive plasma. Even the gentle-looking Jaloi, a race known more for their aquatic poetry than battle, deployed electromagnetic towers that could disable armor systems with harmonic pulses. Kalen, in contrast, stared blankly at his console. His virtual army setup menu blinked at him, ready to accept commands. Instead of rushing, he took a deep breath, then slowly navigated through the interface. Not to build forces, but to intentionally create an army that looked weak, illogical, and barely functional. He selected a few infantry units with low armor stats, positioned them in an open valley with no natural cover, and gave them only basic projectile weapons. He then activated the external spectator stream, an optional broadcast that allowed other cadets to see his strategic outline in real time. Across the room, an elongated cephalon male named Zorthal Creed noticed Kalen's choices and scoffed aloud, his translucent facial fronds trembling with mockery. Is he suicidal, or is this human simply too stupid to understand what war means? A few chuckles echoed from the consoles nearby. Kalen heard them, of course. He adjusted his visor but didn't respond. Instead, he began crafting the narrative he wanted the others to believe. Through the system's optional message boards, used mostly for gloating or taunts, he sent out a public message. My plan is simple. Hold the valley, nothing else. If I fall, so be it. Glory is in the challenge. To the other cadets, it looked like a surrender, masquerading his valor. To Kalen, it was bait. He knew the psychology of war. He understood the ego of commanders who trained for epochs in artificial scenarios where power equaled dominance. He counted on their arrogance, on their desire to win with spectacle rather than wisdom. His early choices were meant not to defend, but to provoke. By building a small, pathetic army and placing it in plain sight, he hoped to appear as an easy target. And with the public message implying stubborn pride, he added just enough hubris to make himself irresistible prey. Meanwhile, the rest of the arena buzzed with activity. The alien cadets ran test nexus of their formations, used predictive algorithms, and employed complex decision trees to anticipate enemy movements. Kalen, by comparison, added no special conditions to his units. No traps, no enhancements. At least not visibly. Admiral Zephyrin moved through the rows occasionally, glancing at each cadet's display. When he arrived at Kalen's console, he paused for a few seconds longer than necessary. The insectoid's compound eyes blinked twice, an expression of curiosity, or perhaps disbelief. "You appear to have misunderstood the assignment," Zephyron stated flatly. Kalen looked up. "On the contrary, sir, I believe I've understood it far too well." The commander said nothing more, and moved on. As the simulated terrain finalized its structure, the cadets were prompted to name their factions. The alien groups chose fearsome titles: Iron Claw, Dominion, Krexar, Eternal Legion, Star, Lance Armada. Kalen typed in his name without ceremony, the passive resistance. Again, laughter rang out across the rows. Kalen didn't care. He leaned back, watching the others meticulously fine-tune their every placement, optimize their formations, and prepare ambushes. He noted the subtle glances some cadets gave to his exposed position. That was good. He needed them, focused on him. He needed to be the glittering gem that distracted the predators while they quietly turned on each other. Time ticked down. 10 minutes remained before the Nexus launched into real-time strategy. Kalen activated a subroutine to monitor cross-channel communications. Some alien teams were already talking behind closed encryption loops, forming alliances, planning joint assaults. And already 2 separate teams had discussed striking Kalen's forces first. He smiled. That was exactly what he wanted. As the final seconds ticked down, the air inside the chamber grew electric. Holographic projectors hummed, creating a seamless battlefield visible from all angles. The alien students stood poised behind their control consoles, eyes fixed on their respective sectors. Some barked commands in languages composed of sound vibrations or chemical pulses. Others used neural implants to give silent orders. Above the Nexus, a large digital clock began its descent from 3 stellar time units. The war had begun. Kalen remained still. His virtual army sat exposed in the basin of a narrow valley, surrounded on all sides by higher ground. His units hadn't moved an inch since placement. From a tactical standpoint, his position looked like a blueprint for disaster. No flanking cover, no escape route, no technological enhancements. It was a sitting duck surrounded by raptors. He adjusted the mind link halo slightly and watched the data streams. Already Commander Hrumar had rerouted his entire left flank toward Kalen's valley. Hrumar's Cephalon troops, a sleek army of shape-shifting combatants with cloaking capabilities, were originally positioned to engage the Xanthari across the eastern cliffs. But now his formation twisted west, drawn to the apparent weakness that Kalen had laid bare. Rumar wasn't alone. Another faction, this time under the command of General Dravik, a thick-shelled Molon strategist, had ordered an artillery division to move toward the same coordinates. The Molon war machines, while slow, could pulverize entire battalions in under 30 seconds. Inside the Nexus, Kalen's small army stirred for the first time. He issued a single order, hold formation. To the observing cadets and instructors, it looked like surrender. A few even laughed aloud. He's frozen with fear. One Voktun student muttered, watching his screen with smug satisfaction. Earthlings weren't made for war. The alien cadets assumed Kalen was cornered, exposed, overwhelmed, and unprepared. But that was the trap. Kalen had gambled on their instincts. He had bet that commanders bred for conquest would see humiliation as opportunity and caution as cowardice. So far, the bet was paying off. As Hrumar's forces crept closer, his private channel with General Dravik lit up. The Kafalon general suggested a joint attack. Split the human forces, share the glory. But General Dravik, proud and old, even by his species standards, refused to collaborate. "You may take the kill, insect," he hissed, "but I will take the victory." Their alliance fractured before it began, instead of coordinating. The two factions began racing toward the same target, trying to outpace one another for the credit of eliminating Kalen. From the outside, it looked like strategy. In reality, it was pride morphing into recklessness. Kalen watched their movements like a chess master, reading desperation in a poorly timed Queen's Gambit. Meanwhile, other commanders were watching this cluster of activity near Kalen's valley. A few sensed blood in the water and began inching their own units toward the area, hoping to mop up whoever survived the initial fight. A silent war of position erupted on the outer edges of the battlefield as factions began subtly adjusting their units, not to attack Kalen, but to be close enough to strike the weakened winners. The battlefield, designed for 20 distinct armies to clash in a balanced series of maneuvers, had already begun tilting. Kalen still hadn't fired a single shot. His console displayed the heat maps of incoming enemies. The bright red signatures of approaching units turned the Nexus's green valley into a storm of movement. He leaned in and whispered a command. "Deploy scouts." No combat. A few of his under-armored infantry units peeled off and jogged toward the hills. These were not elite soldiers. They carried no explosives, no high-velocity rifles, just basic mobility and visual sensors. Their mission was to be seen. Kalen needed Hermar to believe the valley was being reinforced, that the human was stupid enough to hope help would arrive. He needed Yerkovon to see those same units and believe Hermar had already begun the assault without him. He wanted them angry, irrational. The Nexus terrain shifted in real time. A dust storm kicked up in the far north, obscuring visibility for several units. The AI system introduced environmental variables to test adaptability. To most cadets, it was a distraction. To Kalen, it was opportunity. He rerouted 2 of his visual decoy units into the dust zone, not to fight, but to transmit false readings through jamming frequencies. These distorted signals made it seem like a larger force was preparing to flank from the north, where there was none. When Hermar intercepted the feed, he interpreted it as an attempt by Yerkovon to steal the kill. He gave the order to accelerate his cloaked advance, and for the first time, he activated fire protocols. Plasma bolts rained down toward Kalen's scouts. Kalen immediately pulled them back, signaling a retreat. His units appeared to flee, and panic and the others bought it. To Yerkovon, it looked like Hermar had broken their mutual understanding and attacked first. To Hermar, it appeared as though the human had been inches from collapse, only for Yerkovon's interference to threaten the glory. Neither general could tolerate insult. Yerkovon's artillery fired, but it wasn't aimed at Kalen's valley. It hit the hills to the south, where Hermar's stealth units had taken cover. The explosion disrupted the cloaking grid and exposed hundreds of soldiers. Hermar retaliated instantly. The Nexus platform glowed with sudden battle. Fire erupted across the hillside. Cloaked troops were incinerated. Artillery shells burst in flaming arcs. Entire units vanished from the field within seconds, and Kalen watched it all unfold from the center. Untouched. Across the arena, cadets were whispering now. The laughter had died out. Admiral Zephyron stood near the observation deck, arms folded behind his back, unreadable in expression. Kalen sent one final message through the Nexus's public channel. Glory has a price. Let them decide who pays for it. He then muted all external feeds and turned to his command console. Only now did he activate the core of his true plan. From behind the hills and forests at the Nexus's western border, hidden until now under stealth code and digital fog, his secondary units came online. Quantum Striders designed not for frontal assault, but for mobility in the chaos of the self-inflicted war between Hermar and Yorkvan. No one noticed them moving. They slid between detection grids and avoided combat zones, making their way around the conflict, like a surgical instrument avoiding the bone. Kalen didn't smile. He wasn't interested in gloating. He was watching something else. A counter flashing in the corner of his screen. The Nexus's AI had begun recalculating battle dominance scores for every unit the two alien commanders lost in their feud. Kalen's percentage ticked upward. He hadn't fired. He hadn't struck. But by existing as a threat, he had shaped the battlefield. By the 30-minute mark, Kalen's army held the third highest survival rate in the Nexus. By the 45th minute, he was in second place, and still his original valley. Force remained untouched, silent witnesses to a war born of ego and triggered by carefully planted illusions. Kalen's console lit up with a new alert. Enemy forces entering your valley in 4 minutes. He sat up straight, issued 3 new commands, and whispered to himself, "Let's make them finish the job for me." The Nexus clock continued to count down with deliberate precision, its rhythm mirrored by the chaotic flurry of war unfolding on the terrain below. Hrumar's command interface flickered with warnings: units down, detection shields, compromised formation, integrity collapsing. Despite his early confidence, the Cephalon commander was losing control of his forces. Plasma barrages had scattered his troops across uneven ground, making it impossible to regroup under fire. The offensive, which had started with fanfare and dominance, was now dissolving into fragmented firefights with no clear direction. From a separate sector, Dravik watched in silence as Hrumar's units were exposed and eliminated. The Molan commander, still buried deep within a bunker of long-range artillery platforms, clenched his thick-clawed hands. His strategy had been based on overwhelming strength and calculated targeting. But now, with the Cephalon army reacting emotionally and burning through resources, Dravik saw an opening, not just to destroy Hrumar, but to seize a dominant position across the battlefield. He gave a quiet order to his central command, drone advance forward units to the ridgeline and initiate seismic shelling. The moment the command was transmitted, half a dozen heavy tread machines began lumbering across the terrain, their cores glowing with heat. Massive launch tubes emerged from their backs, locking into position with mechanical clicks. The battlefield trembled. From his position, Kalen tracked the shifting patterns. He studied not only troop locations, but the ripple effects of every movement. When Hrumar reacted to Dravik's betrayal, other factions adjusted their own deployments. A third commander, a green-scaled reptilian named Valen Kryn, diverted a flank to probe the edge of Dravik's territory, interpreting the chaos as a weakness. In a nexus designed to reward coordination and vision, alliances were fracturing under the weight of pride and paranoia. Kalen pressed a key. A display opened with real-time sentiment analysis, a feature often ignored by cadets focused solely on firepower. The software measured emotional responses based on the subtle timing and patterning of battlefield decisions. Hrumar was spiking with aggression. Dravik hovered in cold opportunism. Valen Kryn read as cautious but curious. Kalen sent out 2 encrypted pulses. One was intercepted by Dravik's long-range drone, carefully crafted to look like a mistake. The second reached Valen Kryn's communication scanner, framed as a call for support from an anonymous ally. Both messages contained hints, false intel suggestions that the other was planning to betray their allies and seize total control. Within minutes, Valen Kryn's Eastern Division peeled away from its original path and headed toward Dravik's Ridge, under the assumption that a preemptive strike was required. Meanwhile, Dravik, now believing Valen Kryn to be aligned with Hrumar, redirected artillery systems to target reptilian troop movement near the canyons. Kalen leaned back in his chair, watching it unfold. Like a chain reaction of ego, suspicion, and ambition, the battlefield erupted into scattered eruptions of violence. Units fired on allies mistaken for enemies. Generals issued contradictory orders to retain advantage while avoiding entrapment. The Nexus, once envisioned as a clean test of strategic brilliance, devolved into a mosaic of misdirection and panic. His own troops remained largely untouched. The force he had positioned in the valley continued holding its ground with mechanical discipline. Meanwhile, his secondary unit, the mobile cavalry detachment he had activated in the previous phase, had advanced quietly through the unguarded outer zones. Using stealth mapping and signal dampeners, they now surrounded one of the largest unclaimed supply caches in the Nexus. Kalen gave the signal. Within 30 seconds, his mechs secured the site, rerouted the resources, and deployed portable shielding towers for defense. His point score rose again. Commander Vakesh, monitoring the Nexus from the upper gallery, leaned in toward the evaluation board. His dark compound eyes flicked between metrics. Kalen Voss was climbing the ranks without any major engagement. His survival rate was near perfect. His efficiency to research mech ratio was the highest of any cadet on record. Most impressively, his psychological influence. Metrics usually theoretical in application had spiked far above average. Still, Vakesh said nothing. He observed back on the field. Humer had regained a sliver of cohesion, rallying a smaller but still potent force around his central command unit. Enraged by the betrayal and bleeding from losses, he issued a rallying cry across the Nexus's intercom network. All who remain neutral shall be devoured. Only Dominion survives. The broadcast had its desired effect partially. A few fringe cadets responded with fear, aligning themselves with Hrumar, but more of them saw it as a desperate bluster. Some mocked it. Others used it as justification to fire back. Kalen, for his part, took advantage of the chaos. He initiated a new protocol, psychological mimicry. One of his tertiary drone units, designed with voice modulation and signal broadcasting, was ordered to transmit Hrumar's message again, but with subtle alterations targeting Valen Kryn and Yurkvan individually. The messages were timed to sound like secret alliances, intercepted transmissions meant for internal ears only. To Valen Kryn, it sounded like Hrumar, promising to flank Yurkvan and grant the reptilian command over the central plateau. To Yurkvan, it appeared as though Valen Kryn had already pledged support to Hrumar, and the two were dividing spoils. Both messages were believed. Within minutes, Valen Kryn attacked a nearby Hrumar outpost, claiming betrayal. In retaliation, Yurkvan bombarded a Valen Kryn command node, eliminating 50 units in one strike. Kalen watched the carnage unfold like a slow-burning orchestra. His smile, faint and brief, faded as he returned to the data. He opened a new interface and analyzed the long-term projections. Based on unit depletion rates, power consumption, and position density, most factions would collapse within the next stellar time unit. His own resources, untouched and efficiently distributed, would allow for re-expansion during the final phase. Still, there was risk. A small alliance had formed in the north. 3 minor factions, sensing the destructive spiral below, had opted for caution. They merged command under one banner, pooling resources and creating a mobile fortress, supported by a floating stellar lance array. Though not strong enough to dominate, this alliance posed a long-term threat, especially if it remained unnoticed. Kalen marked them on his map with a golden circle. He did not plan to engage them yet. Instead, he made them useful. He broadcasted a new encrypted signal. Not to them, but to a fourth commander, a young and impatient strategist from the desert world of Korolfesh. The signal suggested that the Northern Alliance was preparing a final phase assault on the Central Zone. Kalen's territory. The Corvette commander, brimming with competitive pride and seeking to prove himself against stronger enemies, took the bait. He redeployed all heavy infantry northward. Kalen issued no response. He merely activated 3 reconnaissance drones to record the battle-gather intel and then fade back into stealth. As the Nexus passed the 90-minute mark, the battlefield had transformed completely. Dozens of original units were gone, armies shattered, commanders turned against former allies. Kalen had not issued a single direct attack order since the first deployment, and yet his influence had reshaped the terrain more effectively than any explosive. When the broadcast declared the Nexus had entered Phase 3, Kalen sat forward. He opened his personal log and typed a note. "Prepare the valley. Fortify, the collapse is coming." He knew what was next. The remaining cadets would begin to see through the chaos. Some would suspect manipulation. A few might piece together the pattern. Eventually, one would realize that the human with the silent army and the unmoving command post had not been a victim, but the architect of their failure. He had to be ready when that moment came. The Nexus clock struck the 2 stellar time unit mark, and the battlefield, once governed by carefully calibrated logic, now resembled a shattered chessboard. Ruins of alliances littered the terrain, scorched metal and pulsing energy fields, marking the graves of fallen strategies. The AI managing the Nexus deployed random environmental anomalies, tectonic quakes in the southern ravines, magnetic surges, disrupting targeting systems, and meteor showers that struck with unpredictable precision. These additions were meant to stress-test adaptability under dynamic pressure for Kalen. They were just another layer of opportunity. His eyes moved across the screen, tracking 3 points of interest simultaneously. The first was the supply cache his cavalry units had secured earlier. It remained unchallenged, protected by low-level energy shields and monitored by aerial drones circling like silent sentinels. The second was the formation of the Northern Alliance, now reduced to 2 factions after the failed attempt by the Coral Vec commander to breach their defense lines. The third was the movement of Saravax, who after suffering significant losses had retracted into the desert plateau near the Nexus's edge, likely attempting to consolidate and regroup for a final offensive. But it was the fourth development, an alert blinking amber on Kalen's interface, that truly caught his attention. A new coalition had formed, and it was targeting him directly. 4 commanders, all mid-rank in the Nexus's leaderboard, had entered into a silent truce, coordinated only through encrypted transmissions. Their initial tactics differed wildly. One favored spectral recon drones, another used teleporting infantry, the third specialized in kinetic shockwave cannons, and the fourth ran AI-directed flanking maneuvers. But now all of them were converging on a single objective: the Central Valley. For the first time since the Nexus began, Kalen's position was not underestimated. He had risen to the top of the rankings, and now he had become a threat worth eliminating. He watched their formations appear like red stains on the terrain overlay. Their paths were coordinated, their approach was swift, their intent was obvious. He took a slow breath, steadying his mind. He had prepared for this. In the previous cycles, Kalen had refrained from activating 2 key resources: the dormant satellite override and the subterranean deployable bunkers hidden beneath the valley floor. Most cadets used their high-tech bonuses early in the game to secure fast kills or defend weak flanks. Kalen had stored his refusing to trade long-term leverage for short-term spectacle. Now he accessed the override command for orbital surveillance, redirecting the Nexus satellite toward the southern ridge. A live feed blinked open, revealing the enemy coalition's advance with stunning clarity. He zoomed in on their pace, noting the distance between forward scouts and rear artillery. Too wide a vulnerability, he opened a direct command channel to his infantry commander, the AI directing his valley forces, and gave the order to divide into 3 cells. The first would remain visible in the center, a tempting target. The second would rotate behind the western ridge, equipped with signal jammers and spike traps. The third would dig in beneath the bunkers and lie dormant until triggered. Then he activated the second protocol: seismic mesh disruption. Dozens of metallic stakes buried across the valley vibrated to life. Powered by ambient field energy, they scrambled motion sensors and thermal imaging within the zone. For any army entering the field, it would be like walking into fog with a blindfold. His enemies would still fire, still maneuver, but their accuracy would plummet, and their cohesion would begin to erode. From the corner of the chamber, Commander Vrakash narrowed his eyes. He had seen thousands of Nexuses in his time, but few cadets had ever used patience as a weapon. What Kalen was doing wasn't textbook war strategy. It was behavioral manipulation at a scale that approached mastery. The first volley hit the kinetic cannons launched by the Coalition's northern unit, struck the center of the valley with ground-cracking force. Explosions shattered dust and debris across the zone. The front line of Kalen's decoy troops absorbed the shock and scattered as intended, simulating a panicked retreat. His enemies interpreted this as a successful breach. The second wave surged forward. Teleporting soldiers blinked into position behind cover. Spectral recon drones descended from above, and AI tanks rolled forward with blazing precision. But the jamming systems kicked in moments later, scrambling their coordination. Half the drones crashed into trees or spiraled aimlessly. The teleportation grids miscalculated elevation, materializing infantry inside solid rock formations, and the tanks, unable to track targets, fired blind into mist and mountain. Kalen responded without a word. He triggered the bunker release. Steel panels opened from beneath the valley's crust, and a fleet of spider-like mechs emerged in perfect silence. These machines had remained undetected for over 2 stellar time units. Their cores cooled, their processors muted. Now they activated in unison, crawling beneath the blind spots of enemy scanners. Kalen watched as the mechs weaved through the chaos. They launched magnetic grapples to disable tank threads, planted EMP charges on drone launchers, and sliced through infantry with precision strikes before vanishing again. It wasn't a frontal war. It was an execution. By the time the coalition realized they were being counterattacked, half of their units were gone. Panics spread across their command feeds. Messages flickered across the shared interface. Units not responding perimeter, breached no visuals on enemy signal loss. Kalen gave no further orders. The Nexus's physics engine had been fully engaged now. Every fire, every collapse, every structural failure had consequences. A drone crash near a fuel depot triggered a chain reaction. One of the teleport beacons malfunctioned and opened a vortex that swallowed its own operators. Kalen's army simply stepped back and let the Nexus's entropy finish what his machines had started. The 4 commanders tried to retreat, but the mist, the mines, and the mechs hemmed them in. They turned on one another, each assuming betrayal, each interpreting the chaos as sabotage. 2 of them activated self-defense protocols that resulted in the destruction of their remaining units. Kalen remained silent. When the dust settled, only 1 unit from the entire coalition remained. A single artillery drone limping through the valley. Its weapon refused from heat damage. He allowed it to wander, a ghost of ambition. His console beeped. Simulation control. Your territory now holds 62% of total surviving assets. He exhaled slowly. His ranking surged again. Only 2 major opponents remained. Yorkvon, who had fortified the central ridge, and Valen Kryn, who had stopped attacking and instead deployed recon teams toward the crater fields. Kalen understood the implication. Yorkvon was digging in. Valen Kryn was watching. The next move would define the outcome. He sent a silent signal to his cavalry unit, still holding the supply cache. Move south. Do not engage. Position near Yorkvon's rear line, but remain cloaked. He also activated the hidden command embedded into his command script from the start. Operation False Echo. A recorded broadcast of his own voice played across the terrain. An intentional leak scripted days in advance. I've calculated Yorkvon's perimeter defenses. Prepare to strike east. Full push in 10 minutes. Valen Kryn intercepted the transmission exactly as planned, and just like the others before him, he took the bait. The final stretch of the Nexus approached, and tension inside the Astralis War Conservatory's auditorium was nearly tangible. Rows of alien cadets, sat rigid faces lit by the glow of their holographic interfaces, each eye locked on the ongoing strategy that had shifted the very meaning of warfare in the minds of those present. Kalen Voss's name now sat at the top of the leaderboard, highlighted in silver. Most had stopped focusing on their own scores. They were watching him. Inside the Nexus. The false broadcast Kalen had deployed spread like a virus. Valen Kryn units already strained from prior losses began converging on Yorkvon's eastern flank. With sudden urgency, Kalen observed every movement with quiet concentration. The reptilian commander had interpreted the message exactly as intended, believing Kalen's army was preparing to engage Yorkvon, and that by attacking first, he might weaken his rival and steal the advantage. Valen Kryn's mistake wasn't just in believing the broadcast, it was in acting without confirming its authenticity. Kalen initiated a visual deception grid using terrain-based refraction to simulate moving infantry on Yorkvon's eastern side. Valen Kryn's scouts confirmed the illusion. He gave the order. The desert-born general's strike force surged over the cracked lands with jet-assisted walkers and glider-borne infantry rushing to outmaneuver what he thought was a coordinated assault. But as his forces crossed the threshold of the crater fields, Kalen's trap activated dozens of seismic triggered compression mines. Buried beneath the surface detonated in sequence, collapsing the terrain and splitting Valen Kryn's army into isolated pockets. Dust and debris clouded visibility, and in the confusion, Kalen's spectral recon drones descended from the cliffs, not to attack directly, but to generate echo signatures that further misled Valen Kryn's tactical AI. The confusion spiraled Valen Kryn's command node, unable to adapt, began issuing contradictory orders, some to retreat, others to advance, many to stand still and await clarification. The reptilian general attempted to override the AI manually, but the cascading failures were already in motion. His remaining tanks, split from infantry, were overwhelmed by environmental hazards. Kalen had laced into the zone, stellar time units earlier. Plasma vents, disguised as natural geothermal fissures. Within minutes, Valen Kryn's final units were eliminated, not by brute force but by their own disarray. That left only one Yerkovan had remained silent throughout the exchange. His units held formation around the central ridge with military precision. Turrets rotated slowly, heavy artillery locked into place. Reinforced bunkers nested in tight formations that dared anything to try and breach them. He had watched the chaos unfold and had not moved. That discipline made him dangerous. Kalen respected that. He now had two options. He could attempt a direct assault and risk significant losses, or he could do what he had done since the beginning: manipulate the mind behind the machines. He chose the latter. Kalen's hands hovered above his console as he accessed the enemy's remaining transmission logs. He sifted through Yerkovon's prior communication frequencies, searching for patterns, phrasing emotional cues. The Molon commander rarely spoke, but when he did, his tone was rigid, his vocabulary calculated. That rigidity was his strength and his flaw. Kalen crafted a private message. He encoded it to appear as though it came from Yerkovon's own secondary command. AI recently disabled in earlier Nexus stages. The message was brief. Fallback to Ridge 2. Sector compromised, tactical repositioning required for maximum artillery coverage. The signal, when intercepted, would appear authentic, timed and formatted in the exact pattern the Molon forces used internally. Yerkovon hesitated. Kalen watched through the long-range satellite feed as the bunkers began to shift. Turrets retracted. Rear formations peeled away to relocate. A wedge opened in the eastern perimeter, just wide enough Kalen's cloaked cavalry stationed nearby, since the last phase moved in. There was no resistance. The opening had been meant to accommodate an internal realignment, not an intrusion. Kalen's units slipped into the blind zone between Yerkovon's outer and inner lines and released EMP bursts that fried sensor arrays and power relays. Yerkovon reacted quickly. His units spun back into place. Turrets reopened. Infantry scrambled, but it was too late. Kalen had triggered the final phase protocol, a nexus-ending override that could only be executed if one commander reached 75% territorial control while holding 2 critical nexus nodes. The valley was his. The crater fields were his. The ridge was now fractured. The system acknowledged it. A low chime echoed across the auditorium. The nexus froze. All units vanished into pale blue outlines. Smoke evaporated from the terrain. The terrain faded into flat grid lines. The words appeared in the air above the field. Simulation complete. Victor Massenlach score, 973% record. He. There was silence. Then murmurs. Then voices. Then uproar. In the command box, Commander Vrakash stood motionless. His mandibles twitched once. Then he slowly descended the stairs into the Nexus ring. The cadets stepped aside as he passed. He approached Kalen, who had removed his visor, and stood quietly beside his console. The insectoid commander studied the human for several seconds. His voice, when it came, was neither mocking nor impressed. It was measured. You fired fewer shots than any other participant. You issued the lowest number of direct attacks. You engaged in 0 formal alliances, and yet you controlled the battlefield more completely than any cadet I have ever observed. Kalen said nothing. Vrakash narrowed his eyes. Explain your strategy in 1 sentence. Kalen looked directly at him and replied, I made them see what I wanted, then let them act accordingly. There was no boast in his tone, only truth. Vrakash nodded once and turned away. Later that day, the Academy's official reports detailed the breakdown of the Nexus. Analysts from multiple species dissected the layers of manipulation Kalen had used. False broadcasts, terrain manipulation, reverse psychological signaling, emotional conditioning of opponents, and even silence as a weapon. His final score broke records not just for humans, but for any species enrolled in the Academy's strategic division. Some criticized the tactics, called them deceitful, unorthodox, even dishonorable. Others praised them as genius. Kalen didn't respond to any of it. In the weeks that followed, he was offered placements by numerous factions, command schools, diplomatic corps, intelligence divisions. Some wanted him for warfare. Others wanted him to teach. A few just wanted to study him. He accepted none. He returned to his quarters, filed a formal request to audit the next cycle of Nexuses, not as a participant, but as a silent observer. His reasons, as stated in his submission, were simple. Horses are not won with armies. They are lost through choices. I want to learn how those choices are made. The Astralis War Conservatory approved the request, and thus began Kalen Voss's legacy, not as a general nor a conqueror, but as a strategist who fought with nothing but the map, the mind, and the fragile pride of those who never saw the trap until it had already closed around them.